Okay, so good morning and welcome to another of Action Together's Wednesday weekly sessions. So this is a bite-sized briefing webinar, a collaboration between Action Together, the voluntary, community and faith sector and the public sector. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So today our focus is on emergency response planning. So what this is, what it looks like here in Oldham. And throughout the session, you'll hear from representatives from GMCA, Oldham Council and myself here at Action Together. You'll see sort of our names on the slides there. So I'm going to hand over to Salafa to kick us off.
Morning, thanks Josie. Hi, I'm Salafa Abishal. I'm the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum VCFSE Programme Manager. So I look after the relationship between the voluntary sector and the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum. So as I mentioned, I work for the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum, and they're a key partnership that brings together local organisations like emergency services, councils, health services, the voluntary sector, and more to just make sure that our communities and our emergency responders are prepared for any emergencies we might face in Greater Manchester. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the background to the Civil Contingencies Act and a little bit around the work that we do at the Resilience Forum in Greater Manchester, and then I'll hand over and we can look at a local picture. So just by way of background then, without going into too much detail about Civil Contingencies Act, but it came about after a series of major events in the early 2000s that really showed that the UK's emergency planning needed significant improvement. And those events were known as the 4F, so that's floods, fuel protests, foot and mouth disease, and the firefighters' strike. And they really highlighted how important it was for different organisations to be able to work together really well during emergencies. So in response to these range of crisis in the early 2000s, the government carried out a major review and recognised that we needed a more organised, clear approach. And the result of that review is what we've got now, which is the Civil Contingencies Act, which was created in 2004. And that just really shows us how different groups should work together when emergencies happen. And so there's a couple of key parts of the Act. And one of those was the creation of the local resilience forums, like the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum. And they bring together those partners that I mentioned earlier. So emergency services, local councils, health services, utility companies, and lots of other local organisations. So we've got over 80 organisations that are part of the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum. And it just covers two main areas of the Civil Contingencies Act. So one is emergency planning and response. So that requires key organisations called Category 1 responders, and I'll come on to that. So it requires them to assess risk in their community, plan ahead and make sure that everyone knows what to do during a crisis. And number two is emergency powers, which give the government special powers to act quickly in serious situations where normal rules might not be enough to protect people. Next slide, please. So in emergency situations, different groups play different roles in helping keep everybody safe. Category 1 responders are the main organisations who are responsible for planning and responding to emergencies. So they're the ones that I've already kind of mentioned a few times, but police, fire, NHS, ambulance, local councils, and their key responsibilities are assessing risks, planning for emergencies and making sure that they can continue to operate during a crisis. They've also got a duty to keep the public informed about risk and send out warning when that's necessary. So most importantly, these organisations must work together to make sure they're coordinated and they can carry out an effective response when an emergency happens. We've also got Category 2 responders, so they're not always directly on the front line, but they do have a really important, vital supporting role. So they're services like utility companies, transport services, and other organisations that help keep essential services ready. And their main job is to work alongside those Category 1 responders, sharing information and ensuring their own services keep going when a crisis hits. There's also many other organisations which don't quite fall under Category 1 or Category 2, and they're referred to as non-category responders. So they don't have formal legal duties under the Civil Contingencies Act, but they still have an essential role in emergency planning and response. So that includes VCSE groups, and it also includes the military, which often surprises people actually, but they don't have a commitment of the Civil Contingencies Act. So thinking about the voluntary sector then, these groups are often the first to provide support to people in an emergency because they're embedded in their communities and they're always there on the scene. So while they don't have the formal duties under the Civil Contingencies Act, we need to really make sure that we are evolving them in our planning and processes around the Resilience Forum, because they've got a crucial role in making sure that our communities are resilient, well informed and supported when an emergency occurs. And I suppose my role is really to look at how we work with the voluntary sector as a resilience forum and make sure that we're having an enhanced response so that our communities are able to respond as well as possible when an emergency happens. Next slide, please. Was there one more, Ryan? Sorry. What was that?
Oh, sorry, that's all I've got, Salafa, from the LRF one and then onto that one, yeah.
Sorry, we go back to the LRF one.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm just going to run through really quickly the role of the Resilience Forum. And so I worked in the voluntary sector for 13 years and I'd never really put much thought into the planning that went behind emergencies. I just assumed that something happens and the emergency services turned up. So it was really interesting to look at the amazing work, the depth of work that goes into make sure that everybody is prepared or as prepared as they can. So again, I'm just going to really run through really quickly what the Resilience Forum does, although I've touched on a bit of that already. So in terms of preparedness, we look at risk assessments, emergency planning, business continuity planning, and that makes sure that local services like healthcare, transport, utilities can continue to function during an emergency. So the community members don't have additional challenges when they're already vulnerable. We look at warning and informing, and we publish a community risk register, and we can share a link to that as well for anybody that's interested. We look at sharing information to make sure all organisations are involved are sharing important information and help kind of improve that coordination planning. We make sure we cooperate, so we need to be able to work well together as emergency responders, and we promote business continuity. That's particularly the local authority, so they help ensure businesses in their area are prepared for emergencies, so again they can continue operating. And then in response, that diagram over on the right, so the LRF mainly functions in preparedness. We look at how we get ready for all of this work. But when an emergency happens, we move into that structure that you can see on the right, where we have a strategic, a tactical and an operational level. And I know that Jake's going to touch on that a little bit later on, so I won't go into that detail. Next one, please, Ryan. And lastly, for me, I just wanted to sort of talk about the work that the Local Resilience Forum covers. We really cover a wide range of incidents, making sure that we're prepared for both unexpected and planned events. So you can see a bit of a range of the things that we've covered there. But there's some no-notice events. So they're sudden emergencies that require an immediate response. So there's a gas explosion, flooding, wildfires, and we make sure that plans are in place so we can act quickly to protect lives and minimise damage. There's also preemptive actions. So those are incidents that could potentially be anticipated. So things like oncoming storms and strikes. So we do a lot of preparedness work around those preemptive actions. And then there's pre-plan events, so large events like the Commonwealth Games. Lots of planning goes into those to make sure that they run safely and smoothly and the public are kept safe. And I'm going to hand over to Jake and Ryan now to talk about the role of the local authority in an emergency.
Yeah, thanks, Salafa. So good morning, everyone. My name's Ryan Piggott. So I also work for the Combined Authority in the same team as Salafa, and I'm one of the business partners. So my role is around supporting Oldham Council, supporting Jake and the team there in terms of their emergency planning, their work that they do to achieve what Salafa's just described under the Civil Contingencies Act, all those different elements of planning and training and exercising. And that's really what we're here to kind of support and build with the council. So we just wanted to cover a little bit in terms of what this means locally for Oldham. So Oldham Council, just like any other local authority across the country, has got a number of core functions that they should kind of be working to during an incident. So the real one is around civic leadership that you see there on the screen. So if we think back to, things that have happened in the summer in terms of the events around the disorder and some of that unrest, having that kind of strong sense of leadership to guide the community, and particularly that then links into the community recovering from incidents, and that's a really key one for any local authority, and they will take on the role of leading any kind of community recovery efforts. But in between all that, you've got a number of other responsibilities that Oldham Council will get involved in. So they'll be right there at the front working alongside the emergency services. So if there's a flood or a fire, there'll probably be someone representing Oldham Council at that scene, working alongside the police and the fire and ambulance services. And then another key element is around supporting displaced people and providing that humanitarian assistance. So when we talk about that, we mean maybe opening a rest centre or what we call a reception centre for people to go and stay at, or just get some support, some advice in terms of what's happened. That might be like a local leisure centre or a library, for example. And then also around kind of providing public health advice. So the council's got a key role in that, linking back to the warning and informing of the community to make sure everyone knows what is about to happen or what has happened, and also what they need to do about it or what support is out there. So hopefully some of these kind of responsibilities probably feel like they link up to some of the support that the voluntary sector can provide. And I know Josie will go on to kind of explain how the two link together, but certainly around supporting displaced people, that humanitarian effort is really where that support from the voluntary sector could be really valuable to us. I also just wanted to touch on and expand a little bit from what Salafa mentioned around the Civil Contingencies Act. So the local authority, Oldham Council, is what we describe as a Category 1 responder from the examples that Salafa went through. And that means with that, there's a lot of duties. We get told that we have to do a lot of things as part of that. So a really key one is around cooperating with those other responding agencies, making sure that we're working together, that we're sharing information, making sure that all of that planning and preparedness that Salafa spoke about is done in a collaborative way, so that we know what we're doing, but also the police know what they're doing, and we've not missed any gaps between each other. And as you go through those other ones in terms of risk assessing, making sure that we've got plans in place, the warning and the informing that I've spoke about, that communication to the public, these are all the kind of duties that we're having to make sure that we've achieved, that we've done that in advance of an incident. But it's clear to see how some of these then translate into the kinds of things that we pick up during an incident. They really help us in having those emergency plans at the ready that will tell us if somewhere floods or if there's a fire, this is what we need to do. And part of that that we're speaking about today is then that collaboration and that arrangement with Action Together and with the wider voluntary sector that can really help us deliver some of this. So I'll hand over to Jake now, who's from Oldham Council, to step through the next slides.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Morning, everyone. My name is Jake Carter. I'm the Senior Emergency Planning and Events Manager for Oldham Council, a newly created role that works under our Head of Emergency Planning, Darren McGrattan. So like Salafa touched on earlier, we as a local authority and our internal response to emergencies, you can see here in this pyramid matches that same command and control structure. So we at the operational or bronze level, as we also call it, have our forward incident officers. And for the council, they're essentially our eyes and ears on the ground, if you like. So in the case of an emergency, if the local authorities requested there, it would be our bronze officers who would attend on scene. Then going up a level to our tactical one, we've got our emergency control centre, which is responsible for turning out our silvers. And they are essentially our tactical lead. They would coordinate the response of local authority assets, and they're responsible for the sort of decision making and sort of work closely with the bronze at incidents to get that information, that key information from other partners at the scene, and use that to determine the appropriate assets and response from the local authority. And then at the top of that pyramid, we have our strategic goals. So they're largely within the local authority, the senior management team. And their role is essentially to be involved in that wider strategic, sort of reputational risk, ensuring that everything runs smoothly. And they would be involved in sort of major incidents and things like that, typically. And the reason we run it like that as a local authority is that to try and mirror that external approach that you can see on the left there, so that we have that similar level of approach from a local authority perspective, so that when we're responding to incidents, we have the same level of resource as other organisations do. Next slide, please. So here I can just put on a few examples. We have many partner organisations and other emergency services that we work with in our role as the local authority. Like Ryan touched on and Slav touched on earlier, the Category 1, Category 2 and Category non-responders are all sort of mixed in here. But these are just a few small examples in a sense of some of the responders that we would work with. Or that we'd be working alongside at emergency planning incidents. So that kind of, if we could just press next on the slide, we can see there that Action Together in our role here, that's what we're trying to see from this. So Action Together becomes another one of our many brilliant partners that we would work with on a day-to-day basis, and in that kind of emergency planning and response role. Onto the next slide, please. So then how and when might we actually ask for Action Together support? I thought was an important thing to touch on for everyone that might be watching this. So typically that would be during the either a response or recovery phase of an incident. So what we mean by that is if our bronze, for example, is turning out to an incident, and our silver and our gold and our internal structure, it'd normally be like, as Ryan touched on earlier, that kind of human displacement and that humanitarian assistance. That would be when the local authority might ask for the VCFSE sector's help, which would be through yourselves with Action Together. Mobilisation for that then during an emergency, our sort of agreement covers working hours, so 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. With just the best endeavours outside of those times. So we'd ask for your help, but if it's outside of those times, we wouldn't necessarily expect you to be there, or you know, sort of boots on the ground, turning up immediately. And then our first contact into Action Together would be with your Oldham Strategic Lead Officer, which I believe is Laura Windsor Wells. So any contact that we make with Action Together to request help would come through Laura. And I believe now I'm going to hand over to Josie to cover sort of a bit of the role of Action Together.
Great, thanks, Jake. So yeah, my name's Josie. I'm the operations manager for the Action Together Oldham team, and this is just a little bit about sort of what our role would be in sort of coordinating that response from a voluntary sector perspective. So in sort of the initial planning phases, our focus is more around sort of the preparation and collaboration with the local authority. So we attend Borough Resilience Forum meetings to stay aligned with key partners, ensure that we're sort of ready to respond effectively and we understand sort of what those plans are. We also work closely with the local authorities to review and refine those emergency plans, sort of making sure that they're aware of the capacity and resource that we do have as the local infrastructure organisation, and making sure that they're robust and community focused and reflective of sort of the capacity and resource within local communities. So then comes the response phase. So if an emergency incident was to occur, Action Together would step up to coordinate and mobilise the voluntary sector response. So our role in that would be around bringing people, organisations and resources together to deliver the support that the community needs. Next slide, please. So yeah, how would we go about doing this? So luckily at Action Together, we've got a database of voluntary sector organisations, sort of a really wide database. We've got extremely strong relationships that we've built up with those groups. So communication around that would be critical, and we would look to use sort of the established channels that we already have in place. So we've got e-bulletins that go out regularly, with hundreds of individuals working across the voluntary sector on those mailing lists. We would also use sort of our WhatsApp channels and social media to sort of cascade information, rally support and coordinate resources. So that could be around goods, services and also venues. I think it was Jake or Ryan mentioned the rest centres previously. So yeah, obviously within the community we've got a lot of community assets that could look to sort of provide that rest centre support. Additionally, we would also sort of take the lead in organising a volunteer response. So that could be looking at tapping into sort of the existing volunteer workforce across the sector, but also looking to recruit sort of spontaneous volunteers to meet those immediate needs. Next slide, please. So I just thought I would share a few examples really of how this has worked in the past. I think COVID was, sort of a huge response that relied heavily on sort of that voluntary sector support. So during sort of the pandemic response, we partnered with the council and community-led centres to set up that emergency food and support hubs. So we also supported the Oldham Food Bank by sort of wrapping capacity and resource around their volunteers, enabling them to meet sort of emergency food requests, anyone that was sort of really struggling during that pandemic. And then once sort of a vaccine was made available, we also coordinated that emergency response around volunteer recruitment. So we worked really closely with the NHS, voluntary sector groups and sort of the council to sort of coordinate that volunteer response. We had volunteers within sort of COVID test centres, doorstep testing, and in the vaccination centres as well, which were often being delivered from those community spaces. And then most recently, the response to the 2024 riots. So we worked really closely during that time with Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police to facilitate a briefing for any sort of voluntary sector groups, staff or volunteers that were concerned about what was happening, and sort of looking at how we could best sort of support those groups, but also get their support as well. So that was attended by over 70 community leaders and organisations, and that, you know, sort of the feedback that we've had from that as well was really positive in terms of the way that the council, Greater Manchester Police and the voluntary sector sort of really connected during that time. So yeah, they were just sort of a few examples that I think make it a little bit more real when we talk about that emergency response planning and the role that the voluntary sector can play in that. So yeah, I'll pass back over to Slafa, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Josie. And thanks for listening to us. And hopefully we've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour about emergency planning in Manchester, but also more locally in Oldham. I'm just going to run through some future opportunities for engaging with this work if you're interested in finding out more. We'll obviously continue to work with Josie and with Action Together and the local authority to develop some of these local plans and make sure there's a bit of this coordinated, integrated response. So just so you're aware, we ran some sessions last year particularly for VCFSE organisations, where we looked at sort of summer and winter preparedness, looking at sort of what actions community organisations and faith groups can take to prepare themselves and the community around extreme weather in particular. So, you know, fires, floods, extreme cold, extreme heat even as well. So we ran a session on that in the summer, and next year we'll be continuing to offer those sessions, and we'll pass those out through the networks that Josie had mentioned earlier. And they're really just to help organisations prepare for extreme weather and other seasonal challenges that you might have. In addition to that, we're open to offering training and awareness sessions based on your needs. So we'd love to hear from you about any ideas that you have around training that might support, or even awareness sessions that might support you to get involved in this work. So that could be around business continuity planning. We can offer first aid through our partners. We do sessions on volunteer mobilisation and coordination in an emergency, and we can do that together with Action Together. And we also do sessions on community emergency planning. So again, really keen to hear whether or not any of those would be useful for you. Josie's email and my email are up there, so please do feel free to get in touch with any kind of comments or ideas. There's also some really useful resources that are available on the internet. So there's the government have recently issued their Be Prepared website, and I think we can share a link to that with the recording of this. But that's got some really useful resource and information to support preparedness, and again, just some more general information. There's also a really great site called Communities Prepared, which is really aimed at voluntary sector groups and offers great online training and resource for those, again, who are interested in learning a little bit more about this but might not be able to attend in-person sessions, or, you know, either or who might be time restricted. And again, we've got our community risk register for Greater Manchester. We'll share a link for that. That sort of talks about the specific risks across Greater Manchester and has some preparedness information in that. And that's it, I think. So I hope the session's been useful for you, and thanks again for your time.